Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode is that masterpiece known as The Thin Red Line. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and cinema, letter, always you wrestle inside me. Always you will.
Oh, yes, hello, I am Brian, and yes, today, Cinema to the Letter will come to you in Terrence Malick voiceover form. Just quiet and hushed, and it must be played loud.
Yes. Well, today we've reached the penultimate episode of our Criterion season, where we're talking about our M for Masterpiece. And I think the big thing I want to talk about here, honestly, Brian, is just given that we're talking about The Thin Red Line as our M for Masterpiece choice. This is the first time we've covered a war movie, which, you know, was an interesting kind of genre of film. And we kind of talked about, like, when we were choosing Thin Red Line, we ended up going with it because I doubt we'll be doing a war season of Cinema to the Letter. It just feels like a weird thing to devote an entire season to, honestly, just like different war movies and whatnot. But how do you feel about that sort of subgenre in general?
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, especially growing up, just like watching like movies on cable, you watch like just so many movies. I think I watched like Saving Private Ryan, which is kind of relevant to our conversation here.
Yes.
On like cable, and the kind of ethical or moral questions that come of like, well, you're making entertainment out of like these horrible war crimes or, you know, just horrible things that have happened in human history and stuff like that. And it's, you know, it's interesting. And I think a movie like The Thin Red Line sort of like maybe proposes a different way that we can kind of tackle this idea, which we'll get into. But, you know, thinking of kind of your Saving Private Ryan or like Hacksaw Ridge is another like example I think of just kind of like war movie that is mainly like popcorn entertainment. I think some movies can present themselves as kind of like entertainment, but can maybe do stuff a bit differently, like The Thin Red Line, like we'll talk about. But I think there is kind of like possibly a way we could talk about some anti-war movies that, you know, have a very firm stance on that. But yeah, it is an interesting genre, and as kind of like a history buff and a like, you know, like that's my kind of like dad thing of like getting into like historical war movies. I like a lot of them, weirdly enough, but it is always kind of weird, you know.
Though you haven't transitioned yet into just watching History Channel documentaries at all times, but like, that's what this kind of shit was,
yet.
or this kind of tank.
But I did do that a lot in high school. As you can tell, it was very, very cool and popular.
Yeah, right, you fucking nerd, unlike me, the coolest kid on campus. But yeah, it's interesting because, you know, we did an episode of the old Double Edged Double Bill show a while ago. We did a war episode where we talked about, it was a Platoon and the Revolutionary War movie starring Al Pacino, Revolution. One of the most boring, long movies I've ever seen. And we kind of talked about it there, and I think I still stand by that, like, war is such a, like, weird thing to make a cinematic depiction of. Obviously, there's the famous, I believe it's Truffaut had the quote, right, about there's no anti-war movie because whenever you shoot war cinematically, it makes it look a lot more grand and epic in a way that can easily be misinterpreted as endorsing war, even if you're very anti-war. And I don't quite agree with that quote, in as much as I think maybe at the time when Truffaut made that quote, that was more true than, like, in the wake of, I would say, like, Platoon is kind of like a big sort of line in the sand moment for that kind of thing. Where, I mean, there had been, you know, like, Vietnam movies before that even, like The Deer Hunter and stuff like that, that showed off at least, like, the side effects of war being bad, but that Platoon felt like the really big example of like a big grand war epic where the horrors of war, like in the actual combat, are truly depicted without the kind of like, very simple thing that you would see like an old World War II movie where it's like someone gets shot and it's like, oh, it's a grand thing that I'm dying for my country and then keeling over, that kind of thing. But yeah, with what we're talking about here with Thin Red Line definitely is coming at a specific time where war films are much more like brutal in depicting like the horrors of war. And I think it's a curiosity because like with especially World War II, like arguably the most cinematic war subgenre, in that like there have been like Vietnam movies and even World War I movies, but World War II inherently just has like a built-in kind of like, good versus bad kind of line in the sand for most people would think, at least, that like, oh,
Right.
Nazis bad and other side good, in theory. Which admittingly, even on that good side, as you grow up, you realize that there's like so many different like layers of good and bad and whatever.
Right. Which this movie kind of gets into a little bit.
That's true. It does, yes, as we'll dive into. But yeah, I think the biggest responsibility for a war movie is to kind of depict, that human misery level, which even, as you mentioned Hacksaw Ridge, a movie that I have many complicated feelings about, particularly who made it. Even though you keep pitching a season about that director. You keep really wanting to, and you're so excited for Flight Risk.
I was going to say, he's got a new movie. Hey.
Right around the time this is coming out, yeah, I think Flight Risk will be in theaters.
Gotta get on that flight.
Gotta get on that flight. Move over plane. Flight Risk. Coming to the theaters soon. But yeah, even with that movie at its core keeps the, at least kind of like, horrors of actual combat very central in a way that, doesn't make me want to enlist to any degree, despite how, quite frankly, desperate the military-industrial complex is. Where, like, I'm someone who goes to comic conventions, and it's weird how the U.S. Army always has a booth, and it's like, you're trying to pick out,
Really?
like... Yeah, it's so fucking weird. Like, this is the crop of recruits that you're trying to get. No offense to anybody who goes to a comic convention. I'm part of that.
No,
But
yeah.
why would you, like... I can't imagine, like, a cosplayer going into combat who, like, didn't have previous military experience, like, at all. Like, why are you doing that? This is not a great place to recruit people, I don't think. I don't know if, like, the guy dressed up as Goku is going to be your best bet to go into whatever war-torn country you're trying to invade. Just feels weird. We're talking about a movie today that I would argue does have a lot of, like, cinematic depictions of combat. But at the same time, none of it looks enticing to me. It all just looks like incredibly upsetting to even contemplate dealing with. As we'll get into, let's just jump into it now. Let's jump into The Thin Red Line.
In this world, a man himself is nothing. And there ain't no world but this one.
I've seen another world. Sometimes I think it was just my imagination.
If I go first, I'll wait for you there.
I killed a man. Worst thing you can do. Nobody can touch me for it.
Make no difference who you are. No matter how much training you got, how tough a guy you might be, you're in the wrong spot at the wrong time, you're gonna get it.
I want you to attack right now, with every man at your disposal.
I've lived with these men, sir, for 2.5 years, and I will not order them all to their deaths.
Maybe all men got one big soul everybody's a part of. All faces of the same man.
Who lit this flame in us? Because I have you, nothing can touch me. No hurt, no grief, not even death.
So, The Thin Red Line came out on December 25th, 1998. Great way to spend Christmas. Bring the whole thing to see
That's so funny.
the Thin Red Line.
Didn't know that.
I mean, that might have been just like I don't know if this had one of those weird rollout releases either. This might have been the like original like Oscar contending release, which it was, to be fair, a big contender at the 71st Academy Awards. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, Best Original Score, and Best Sound. Won none of those, interestingly enough.
Crazy.
But yeah, kind of crazy. But it's all credited to our writer-director here, Terrence Malick, who made this movie based on the novel by James Jones. Not the first adaptation of this novel. There was one in, like, I believe, 1964. That, from what I understand, was a lot more of a traditional war movie. But yeah, Malick. This was the main reason we kind of wanted to discuss this movie. Because Malick, as you have said previously, is one of your guys. You love Terrence Malick's filmography. Where did that start?
Like a lot of my other just film love, I think it started in high school at some point, early high school, when I think Badlands must have been the first one I saw. Like, I feel like I saw those first two films he made first, but I definitely remember the one that kind of stuck out to me the most was watching The Tree of Life, which was a huge like moment for me, I think, for just discovering what movies can do. You know, like I think I've told you this before, but like the moment in that movie where it kind of starts out with Jessica Chastain, Sean Penn, like, oh, okay, these are the people who are in this movie, of course. And then that movie becomes about the creation of the universe and dinosaurs and that whole sort of 45-ish minute chunk in that movie. And I just remember being not angry or not like, oh, what is this movie? I wanted Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain, but I remember being like, wait, what is this? What's going on here? This is not. I thought this was a movie about like a bunch of kids growing up in rural Texas. Like, what is this? And it just like really stuck with me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Like weeks after I saw The Tree of Life, and I had to watch it again, and it just like completely changed the way that I like viewed movies and what movies could be and what movies could do and what movies could look like as well. I think, like, you know, we'll talk a bit about Malick's style, which is kind of slowly developing, but that movie, you know, especially with being shot by Emmanuel Lubezki, like, just looks unbelievable, and there's so many incredible images in that movie. You know, I went back and watched The Thin Red Line, I watched The New World, and then I've really developed a love for all of his filmography, and even his later films, which I think some people have kind of back and forth. I feel like they have a bit of a following, especially something like Knight of Cups and Song to Song. But I really even love those movies. They're very improvisational and kind of scraggly and not really, you know, not as cohesive as something like this, not as kind of like put together as something like this. But there's something just about the way that he tackles a lot of human ideas in a very poetic way, as we'll talk about in this movie, that I really love. He also just, you know, plenty of like Catholicism and Catholic ideas and wrestling with that he brings to a lot of his movies also rings very personal to me. And, you know, he also just has a fascinating arc, right, where he made Badlands, Days of Heaven. Days of Heaven comes out in 1978. He takes a 20-year gap from making films and comes back with this movie in 1998. It's a really fascinating story, and just the way that he makes movies as well, I find completely like fascinating. You know, we'll talk about it, of course, with this movie, but he shoots a lot of footage, takes a really long time to edit, sometimes cuts people out of his movies, but just creates these incredibly poetic and beautiful movies. And this, you know, all that rings true for The Thin Red Line, but it is also a like massive war epic. And I think it's really fascinating to see how like Malick's sensibilities kind of like go into that when he's making a war movie. But yeah, I love Terrence Malick. I'm just so fascinated by everything he does. Yeah, I'm kind of curious for you, because we talked about this a little bit, and you are not really a Malick fan. You kind of bounced off a few of his movies, but yeah, I'm kind of curious, like, what's been your journey with him, and where do you like stand with him now, going into this movie?
So when I was younger, actually the first one I saw as well was Tree of Life. I saw it on my college campus, and I remember seeing it with shout out my first roommate Connor. I don't know if you're fucking listening to this at all, but I remember seeing it with him, and he's that dude, very sweet, very like down to earth, normal dude. Who we went and saw this like massive art movie because he's like, oh yeah, Brad Pitt, I like Brad Pitt, and we went and saw that, and he had the very nice but clearly dismissive comment of like, well, that was really different. I didn't really expect that, which is like very fair. That's a very different movie. And I remember feeling, I guess, kind of that similar thing that you were talking about of like, oh yeah, I was expecting like an interesting drama about Brad Pitt, and these like kids kind of growing up in, middle of suburbs Texas kind of thing. And then, I remember just finding it very daunting and very odd in a way that, I was a freshman in college. I was trying to be kind of more open-minded. I was like, well, this is a different kind of movie, I guess. But the sort of film critic circles I was following around that time were either extremely loving of it or extremely dismissive. That movie had a weird kind of like divisive reception amongst certain people. And I remember kind of leaning more toward that, like, the side that would use the dreaded word that I've grown to really hate over the course of like the last, decade or so, pretentious. Like saying like, oh, it's full of itself, it's pretentious, there's no like story here, all this other stuff. And I remember kind of being in that firm camp for a while with like that movie, and then I saw To the Wonder, and I felt a similar way about it. And then as time has gone on, I've explored more of the Malick stuff, like Badlands or Days of Heaven. And then I caught up with a couple in prep for this, including the weird IMAX documentary that he made, Voyage of Time, which has a weird release versions of two, because the only version that's available is the shorter version with Brad Pitt, as opposed to like the theatrical one that's narrated by Cate Blanchett is like legally unavailable due to like weird rights stuff, I think, right? Because there was like a whole lawsuit that happened where someone, like the production company, literally sued Malick for like taking too much time, like for procrastination, quote unquote, about that fucking movie, so you can't watch the full length version of it. So I've at least explored some more stuff, and I really like Badlands or Days of Heaven, and I have kind of come to the conclusion after seeing some of the other ones, the more recent ones, because the only two I haven't seen are The New World and Hidden Life. Hidden Life mainly because it's largely unavailable as well because of Disney. I think I do go into the camp of like, I prefer the Malick that has a bit more of a structure to it, where he can apply his kind of, great eye for, like, very, like, keen perspective shots, a lot of, like, shots that feel like they're plucked from memory, into more of a cohesive story. And I say that loosely, because, like, I revisited Tree of Life, and I find that movie to be, I liked it a lot more, revisiting it. And I think it works because, like, all the stuff that at least hinges around the thematic of, like, Sean Penn's looking back at his childhood and realizing that his dad was, like, emotionally abusive and shitty to him, and kind of reckoning with that. I think that works for me a bit more, having at least that clothesline of, like, at least an emotional tether than, like, quite frankly, I know you like the more recent movies, but Knight of Cups, and particularly Song to Song, I could not keep much interest in fucking Song to Song, despite, having a massive cast and having stuff like Michael Fassbender at one point walking around like a monkey, but mouthing along to seagull squawks. Like, despite that, just like that movie is so long and endless, and I'm like, what are we fucking doing here, guys? What's happening?
I mean, this is the thing about like the later Malicks, right? To the Wonder, Knight of Cups, and Song to Song, is that he mostly made them without a script, without a working script. I think he would have like notes that he would kind of just like give to the actors to guide them along. To the point where Christian Bale, I believe, during Knight of Cups has said that like he would look over at other people's script pages because he never got a script, just like, hey, what's going on? Do you like know what's going on? And I think he's great in that movie. Like I think the thing about like those movies is like, even though I think Knight of Cups is a masterpiece, like low key, I think there's certain sections of that movie that I can tell like this doesn't work. Like this just straight up doesn't work. But then Malick will give you like some of the most beautiful imagery, that I've ever seen. Like I still think of that shot. It's like a really wide shot of Christian Bale just walking along the beach, and you can see like the Santa Monica Pier in the background, and it's just like, holy shit, like this is amazing. And then I mean, there's really weird and goofy stuff in all these movies, and yet there's really beautiful like cinematography. Yeah, it's a really mixed bag, and I think like I completely understand why like some people bounce off of a lot of these later Malick movies. I think what I really have kind of learned, especially just looking at his arc of like his career and his later movies, there is this kind of loose autobiographical trilogy in there in The Tree of Life, To the Wonder, and Knight of Cups, where you get him kind of thinking about his childhood. Then you get him living in, I'm not sure if it's Oklahoma, but Into the Wonder, but I'm pretty sure that's where Malick actually lived, and him dealing with relationships. And the Knight of Cups is him leaving Hollywood, basically, and not deciding to leave Hollywood for 20 years and not make a movie, while also like ruminating on his real life childhood. I think in Tree of Life and Knight of Cups, he has a sibling who dies. Malick in real life did have a brother who committed suicide, I believe, who was a musician. And I don't know, there's a lot of just that really personal stuff that even as like almost Frankenstein together, a lot of those later movies feel, I find really charming and I find really interesting, and especially just how much footage he shoots for all those movies. Like Christian Bale is supposed to be in Song to Song, and he just got cut out because of, you know, whatever Malick's doing. Yeah, I just find it really interesting the way he's kind of continued this pace, and like neither of us have seen A Hidden Life, but I think that is a lot more structured. It had a script, which is kind of crazy.
And he's got the new one coming
yeah.
out, right? The Jesus one.
Yes,
coming
the
out
way
next
the
year,
Way
I
of the
believe.
Wind.
Yeah.
Right, where Mark Rylance plays the devil, which, I mean, sounds so fascinating. And I mean, Malick making a movie about Jesus, like, come on, that's just like so, it's such a slam dunk, I think. Yeah, and I think like to my final kind of point here I want to make though is that like looking at something like The Thin Red Line, where a studio, Fox in particular, gave him like so much money. What was the budget on this movie again?
The budget on this movie was $52 million in 1998 money.
I mean, yeah, it's pretty sizable, especially for someone like Malick, you know, kind of looking back at his career now.
Especially who had made 2 movies 20 years prior to this.
Right, exactly. And obviously we talk about this a lot, that like studios just are not as reluctant, are a bit more reluctant to give a lot of money and big budgets to, you know, really artistic and singular directors like Malick. And I don't know, I find that a little upsetting, because Malick is someone who, especially with that weird trilogy, To the Wonder, Knight of Cups, Song to Song, you can tell he's really working on like a shoestring budget. And I think a lot of that is the producers he worked on with Tree of Life, Sarah Green and Nicholas Gonda, I believe, who were like just really trying to get him to make something, because they're like, we love his work. We want to help him make something. And I know he's in editing for and post-production for that Jesus movie, but I want him to make more movies. And especially as we, you know, we've had a resurgence of like elder directors in their 80s. I believe Malick is in his 70s or 80s, you know, making a lot of like late era movies. I think it's, I don't know. I just would love to see him make more stuff. And I would love for someone like Fox, who has made a lot of his movies, but seemed to have backed off, to, I don't know, at least give him some sort of chance or something, you know?
I can't believe modern Disney wouldn't want that. You know, they seem like the exact people who would want to make a Terrence Malick movie.
Right, exactly. It's another thing.
Yeah. But I will say, too, before we go fully into Thin Red Line, I will at least say I prefer Knight of Cups a lot more to Song to Song, if nothing else, because, like, that movie has a similar thing of, like, I think Malick at his best does, which is, like, once again, that kind of, like, point of view perspective thing of just, like, being immediately in a situation, in that case being, like, wandering around like the vast empty soullessness of Hollywood. I do find fascinating. Particularly, I'm so surprised that dude was able to go onto like a fucking studio lot. I think it's like the Paramount lot or some shit, and just be able to like do like Emmanuel Lubunewski, just allow him to like wander through these vast empty fucking sound stages and shit. I think that's insane. I think it's only because Malick also has the big you know, kind of card that he has is so many people want to work with him. Like, any famous person on Earth would, like, yeah, I'll be in a Terrence Malick movie. Like, particularly in, like, fucking Knight of Cups. The craziest thing is watching that movie and seeing particularly... Obviously, there's, like, Christian Bale, Natalie Portman, like, a bunch of big stars. But how many fucking comedy people just pop up in there? Like Thomas Lennon, Joe Latruglio, Dan Harmon. Just like, what
Shea
what the
Wiggum,
Shea
Ryan O'Neal,
Yep.
Fabio.
Fabio. The biggest star of all, Fabio. One name, of course.
I love that everyone in that movie, like Nick Offerman is in it, and I think his character's name is like Nick, and it's like Fabio as himself. It's the one credit.
I'm surprised he didn't get one of those seagulls from Song to Song to hit him in the face.
No, but I think, yeah, like, it's the thing about, like, Malick that is so interesting, and it kind of relates to this movie, of course, where, like, he can get big stars. Like, Christian Bale clearly likes working with him a little bit, but, like, getting someone like Ryan Gosling, Michael Fassbender, like, Natalie Portman, like, he does attract big stars, and, like, from what you hear from even Jessica Chastain, like, she loved working with him on The Tree of Life. And then you hear from other people, like Christopher Plummer, when he worked on him on The New World, like, hated working with him.
Yeah.
And there's
I 100% believe Christopher Plummer, who's just, like, very efficient, would not want to, like, stand around for, you're shooting a leaf!
There's this really funny, like, Hollywood Reporter roundtable thing where it's him and Michael Fassbender, before he worked with him on Song to Song, where Plummer was like, yeah, and he fucking cut me out of the movie. I'll never work with him again. And, like, Michael Fassbender's just, like, laughing at him, just like, haha, this is funny. And then, like, it's funny that he ends up working with Malick after that. But, yeah, you have these two kind of, like, people love working with him and see his kind of, like, what he's doing, or people, like, get really upset when they get cut out of his movies, which we'll talk about that a little bit more. But, yeah.
Yeah. And especially just one more thought on Night of Cups. It does seem interesting, that movie, sort of being about a more introverted person trying to, like, go around, like, the party culture of Hollywood. That feels like the most autobiographical thing possible, given how infamously secluded he usually is and hates having his picture taken and shit like that, Malick. Where it's just like, I don't want to be around, no problem. And the only time you see him is, like, weird, like, TMZ footage of him and his wife dancing at, like, an Austin bar and shit like that.
Yeah. And I love that you go to his IMDb, and it's that same exact picture it's always been, where it's, like, a picture of him, I think from the set of, like, Days of Heaven. You know, like, it's not even like, contemporary. But, yeah, like, his weird personal life where he's incredibly private and secluded, and also, like, is friends with, like, a lot of people. Like, he produced that Lil Peep documentary about the rapper who, like, apparently he was friends with, like, their family. And he's also just had weird interviews, like, where he was like, yeah, I love Zoolander, like, I loved that movie, it's one of my favorite movies. And I'm like, what? Like, what? This, you know, he's a very, very weird guy. And yet, like, I don't know. And I think that does create a lot of, like, not mystique necessarily, but, like, it creates a certain kind of, like, it puts his work under a certain kind of light, where it's like, this guy just doesn't do interviews, doesn't like being out there. And I think it goes a little bit against that kind of pretentious label, which I agree with you, is, like, is overused, and is certainly overused for Malick. But, like, I don't think he's as pretentious as a lot of people think he is, because, again, he puts his work out there, he takes a lot of time to do it, he's clearly very, like, careful about it, but he doesn't, you know, go out there in interviews, doesn't do, like, he wasn't even at the Oscars when Tree of Life was nominated, you know. He just strikes me as someone who's just very, like, quite humble, and from what I've heard from, like, a lot of actors, like, he seems to be that kind of way. But just a fascinating figure in American cinema, I think.
Yeah, and also I still remember the first time I saw any Terrence Malick photo, I thought it was Rob Reiner, because he looks a lot like Rob Reiner.
He looks like, yeah, with the beard too. Yeah, absolutely.
You can't convince me that any photo of him isn't actually just Rob Reiner standing in. The tell is if he starts talking about, like, Ted Cruz or somebody, and say he's a fucking piece of shit, and I fucking hate him.
I feel like that's the one thing that would distinguish them, because, like, Malick is apparently very, like, soft-spoken and quiet, and yeah, Rob Reiner's just, like, I mean, I always think of, like, his scene from the Wolf of Wall Street, where, like, who has the fucking gall to call at this hour?
Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to make a movie with Morgan Freeman that no one will see.
Make a lot of movies that no one will see.
Or a movie with Woody Harrelson,
No
co-star. Look, that we'll talk about Rob Reiner at some point, but that Miracle Run followed by just nothing He's so fascinating. But yeah, so let's talk about the Thin Red Line, which, basic plot. This one does have a general clothesline plot, like I kind of mentioned earlier. We initially follow Robert E. Lee Witt, is a private that went basically AWOL over in it's Malaysia. Where exactly is he?
The battle itself is on Guadalcanal, so it's around this area. But I am not great at geography.
No,
so
neither am I. Clearly,
I don't know exactly where they are, but it's around Guadalcanal.
I know it's like I think it's Melanesia, right? That's where he is apparently, and he's just hanging out, with the native population, and is usually accepted, but also there's an early point where he's talking to one of the villagers, and they mention just like, I don't know, the kids are kind of scared of you because you look very military. We should probably mention this guy's played by Jim Caviezel, who we previously talked about in Deja Vu. Speaking of Mel Gibson as well, his Jesus.
Oh, God.
Right, yeah. And he ends up getting, brought back into the military by Sean Penn. Another great guy, another wonderful person worth talking about. Who's like, hey, guess what? Since you've been doing all this, we're going to put you in a little correctional battalion, basically, and you're going to, basically be part of, like, Pacific Theater War. And, from there we meet a bunch of other different people. I want to go down this cast list because it's insane.
Oh, yeah, the boys.
Right, and this is mostly alphabetical, except Sean Penn gets first credit because he was still quite a star at the time. But you got Adrian Brody, George Clooney, John Cusack, Woody Harrelson, Elias Koteas, Jared Leto, Dash Mihawk, Tim Blake Nelson, Nick Nolte, John C. Reilly, John Travolta. A massive cast of people who, in particular, were either like on the rise at this point or very, very in demand. Particularly, I was very surprised to see John Travolta in here. This is like right after Face Off and shit. And I'm like, wow, that's insane that he's in this.
This movie has a very famous like ensemble cast of just like guys, just boys. And every time I watch this movie, I forget just how many like people are in this movie and how big of names they are. Like John C. Reilly, I think this is around the time he's doing like Paul Thomas Anderson movies, and like he just kind of shows up and he doesn't really have a huge role, but I'll talk about kind of why I think the casting is really important to this movie. But even like John Travolta being in this, and like, we'll talk about the George Clooney kerfuffle. It's insane. It's an insane cast, and like I think part of it was kind of this like Malick is back. Everyone in Hollywood wants like a role in this movie because like Malick is. I'm pretty sure like I'm not sure entirely as to like how canonical Badlands and Days of Heaven were perceived at this time, but I feel like they must have been kind of like pretty well regarded in terms of like for Malick to get like just this huge cast. It's crazy.
Well, I think they were at least well regarded enough in addition to the like 20 years without doing anything. I think helped kind of build the reputation of those movies, as well as got people interested the moment he's just like, hey, I'm going to start making a movie. Like in 95, I believe, this finally shot. Because the production history of this movie is very like labored, shockingly, for Malick, where like he initially started writing a script in 1989, and he would do it in between, like he was trying to make projects like the first project he wanted to do after Days of Heaven was a movie about Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. And then obviously David Lynch came in and just said, yoink, that's mine. So he's like, oh, I guess I can't do that. And then weirdly, he was going to do a stage adaptation of a movie called Sancho the Bailiff. That was like the big thing that got him into like a lot of like production delays on this movie. And it eventually, like, I think had a couple performances in LA and never expanded after that. So it's just a thing he devoted like endless years to. It's just kind of like fizzled out.
Again, he has such a weird life and career, and just thinking of like that weird 20-year gap where he was like living in like Paris or Italy or something. Like I think there's kind of like speculation that he was working on a lot of scripts in that 20-year gap, but yeah, for him to come back and have this kind of weird comeback, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and then he ended up finally going into production around 95, when originally with Sony Pictures. And literally while he was like scouting around in like Australia, Sony like pulled the plug. like while they were scouting locations, and there was like a whole like conundrum about it. Where I believe it's because they got a new studio head, a classic case of like, oh, new studio head comes in and it's like, what the fuck are we doing with? He's going around Australia. What the hell? Get him out of here! And then Fox agreed to like put in about $40 million to like that was missing from the budget at this point because Sony pulled out on the condition that he would cast 5 movie stars out of a list of 10 who felt interested. And there was also like Pioneer Films, which was a different Japanese film company, put in like another $8 million. And there's also Phoenix Pictures, which was kind of involved from the start. It's a weird like cobbling together once again of like different production companies, which to be fair by modern standards feels quaint because it's not like 45 production logos. Maybe that'll happen with the new Jesus movie, because it'll be like 45 production logos before it starts. And I'm sure the movie will be very short, so it'll be all good.
I mentioned, like, yeah, how weird it is that Fox gave him this, but it is, yeah, I mean, even still, like, he makes movies in a very, very strange way from everything I've seen. It's also just interesting because, like, we're thinking back on this now, having seen, like, this later trilogy that we've seen of, like, really shambly movies. At the time, I like, Malick didn't really have that kind of, you know, kind of reputation, I guess. His films didn't really have that, right? Like, and so I think it's very interesting how kind of difficult it was for him to get even like something like this made, which you would think would be like relatively easy for him to make, but you know, is not, because you know, Hollywood is Hollywood.
Right, yeah, I just can't imagine, like, in a modern world where, like, if Disney was interested at all, they would have it on, like, one of those Marvel timelines and say, like, Terrence Malick project coming, like, December 2027. And then he'd be like, I don't know, I'm gonna edit for, like, another 2 years beyond that. They'd be, like, infuriated. Like, how dare you? We sold out theater chains to make sure that they played the Terrence Malick movie. This particular release date. Like, he's not a guy who can really survive in that kind of climate. And because he's just, like, he takes so long to make movies after like the big increase in production as it were in the 2010s. Like he literally shot that Jesus movie in 2019 and now it's coming out, and like the whole studio system has completely changed while he's been, I don't know, in Austin like editing that fucking movie.
Yeah, I mean it is like even that, like that trilogy we talked about, To the Wonder, Song to Song, and Knight of Cups, like all of those were shot in 2012. He just like really takes his time to edit all of these movies, and it's the fact that like, yeah, he shoots a bunch of stuff because like I think as Michael Fassbender put it, like he's off shooting like a leaf or like a butterfly or something, you know. And like I'm still happy though that like, you know, as much as I want him to make more movies, like he's able to get that Jesus movie made, and he made A Hidden Life and those weird movies, because like as much as like we bemoan a lot of like the way that Hollywood treats filmmakers and Hollywood treats like a lot of creative individuals, like it's still kind of great that he has kind of not compromised on his vision necessarily, even if it means that he kind of has to go through some production difficulties. But I still find it really like admirable, you know.
Yeah. And I also love just this little feature that, like, for context, even with this movie, like, he had 2 editors that helped him out, Leslie Jones and Billy Weber. They edited this movie for 1.5 years before it finally came out. Like, this movie wrapped in 1996. Finally, after, like, it's a long post-production process, you know, like a Marvel movie would usually have. For, like, oh, we gotta put in, like, CG monsters. He's like, let me keep editing this movie. But I just love the little detail that I found out that he was editing a lot of this footage while listening to a Green Day album. I didn't get a specification of which Green Day album. What do you think he's listening to? Do you think he's listening to Dookie?
I was gonna say Dookie or American Idiot, but I don't think American Idiot had come out yet.
No. It would have either been Dookie or the Insomniac, I think, came out around this time. That he was done. Nimrod, maybe. I don't know. Who knows?
Again, just what an enigma of a man. Like, it's so fascinating. And like, I mean, yes, talking about that weird, like, how long this movie took. Like, I was conceived and born in the time it took Terrence Malick to finish this movie. I was born in 1998, and like, you know, he started shooting it in like 96 or something. Like, that's crazy to me, you know?
Yeah, I went through like infancy. Yeah, so with this movie, I'm curious, we mentioned this huge cast. Who's your favorite boy?
John C. Reilly is one of my favorite actors, so I love seeing him. But he doesn't do that much. what I think is so important about like casting A-list actors or actors that you know, like Elias Koteas, who I also just love in this movie. You have so many people, and in war movies you have like so many people. Like Dunkirk is a movie I think is a masterpiece, but has like 500 white skinny British boys that all look the same. And I think for something like this, where like, especially it's World War II, they're all wearing like those helmets and they're all like geared up and everything. Like, it kind of matters that you can just cut to like, oh, here's where Woody Harrelson is. And you don't need to remember a character name. You don't need to remember like a lot of that sort of detail that might just get lost if you know, are watching this 3-hour movie. You could just be like, oh, that's Woody Harrelson. I know what he's doing. I know what his deal is. It's very it's shorthand, and I really love the way that this movie kind of uses that because, you know, you also have people like Jared Leto in this movie who show up for very briefly, but he has a very important scene in this movie. And if that were just like a fucking random like Joe Schmo, like it wouldn't have as much impact, but also you just would be like, who are these people? I don't know who these people are. It just allows you to kind of follow the quote-unquote plot of this movie a lot easier without just getting completely lost in like a sea of identical-looking men, you know?
Well, especially for like even some of these people weren't like huge stars at the time. Like Leto had been in like My So-Called Life and shit like that, but he wasn't like the star who he ended up being. Or even John C. Reilly, he had just been in Boogie Nights, so people might recognize him for that movie, but he was not like the consummate sort of character actor, like warm face that you see all the time, as opposed to like Harrelson, John Cusack, or even like Adrian Brody's a great example of this, where he also was like just very fresh at this point, but he has at least a distinctive face. I think Caviezel has a similar thing where even if like they aren't a star, Malick knows how to like cast very like distinctive faces to make you remember them. Like, all of my love to Adrian Brody, but there are so many points where you cut over to Adrian Brody in this movie, and he looks like a cartoon pelican who's just like very like worried and upset.
Was about to cry, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. He just kind of has that vibe, but in a way that like makes him like stick out and is very memorable, especially for there's a whole story where Adrian Brody like shot so much of this movie and was convinced like, oh, I'm like a key character in this. I'm like somebody who helps like, to quote him, like carry the movie basically. And he kept telling this in interviews, and he said it to like his family who he brought to the premiere. And if you watch this movie, he has maybe 10 minutes of screen time just over the course of the whole movie, and he was gobsmacked by that, just because through the editing process he ended up being much more of a smaller though pivotal character as in this final cut.
We can talk about this especially with Clooney, who I think was more like angry. I don't know if Brody was like, from what you glean, was he more angry, or was he just kind of like, oh, I just surprised, I guess.
I think more embarrassed because he talked how much about like, I'm really crucial to the movie, and then just imagine being there with your family. It's like, you were barely in that movie. Shut up, Mom, okay? He managed it a lot. He was like here a year and a half. He was listening to Dookie while he was doing this, okay?
Yeah, I'm sure he played it on set while they were like shooting these huge set pieces. I mean, I certainly like understand why, like, if you're an actor and you're cut out of a movie or your role gets cut down significantly, like, I fully get that, you know, and it's like if it can feel like you're doing a lot of work for nothing necessarily. David Fincher has a very like extreme stance on like actors are not like this precious kind of thing, right? According to, he's like, actors are just another sort of like production design, like cinematography, like it's another sort of like aspect of the movie that forms the movie. I understand, you know, that if you're an actor and you do all like you shoot a shit ton of footage and it largely gets cut out, it can feel kind of like, you know, what am I doing here? But I do think to a certain extent, of course, the end product like really matters. The end film really matters. And when I watched The Thin Red Line, like, you know, of course I'm thinking about like, God, George Clooney's in fucking like 2 seconds of this thing, but it's a masterpiece. It's an absolute, like, it's an incredible film. And I think, like, you know, to Adrian Brody or Christopher Plummer in The New World, like, they make that movie better. Maybe they're not the leads, maybe they're not carrying the movie like Brody says, but they do add something to the movie and they make the movie what it is. And so like I really do sympathize with like actors who feel that way, who get cut out of Malick movies, but I think this movie's pretty fucking incredible, and a lot of that comes from just the way that Malick like edits a lot of his movies. And you know, it's a little hard for me at least to kind of argue with this final piece of art, I think, but you know, it is complicated. I understand though.
Right. I mean, plus at the very least, like Brody and Clooney, like you weren't like Bill Pullman, Lucas Haas, Mickey Rourke, or Billy Bob Thornton, who got cut out of this movie. Even Billy Bob just did narration. He was like going to be one of the many people that whisper in like this. So imagine just Bad Santa, just whispering like, can you believe the horrors of war? Can't believe it's all around. I mean, to be fair, you can't have him and Nolte, I think, be narrators in that way. Because like I think they would have like a growl off that wouldn't quite like work out that well.
I was gonna, you know, when you asked me like who's my favorite like boy in this, like weirdly this time we're watching it, Nick Nolte is kind of like one of the MVPs of this movie.
Well, he's not. I said favorite boy. That's more a favorite man.
Oh, sure, that's true.
Nick Nolte
that's
is
true.
a man underlined.
He is absolutely. His character, which can come off like in the rest of the film, is like this like horrible, like evil kind of general guy who's like really cruel to his like men. But like that voiceover you get early on where he kind of explores like how he has kind of been ground down by the military and just these years of service, and he feels like it's for nothing and he should be higher than in a higher position, and just this kind of like, you know, seeing him have to be kind of subjugated to like John Travolta's like condescending like speech before they, you know, like all that stuff I think is so crucial to like when you get later Nick Nolte and he's being like angry and putting on this like, you know, he's putting on this facade of the military general or the military, you know, leader. And, you know, I think it's one of the brilliant things this movie does is kind of bring a lot more humanity to that kind of thing. But I think I'm getting a bit ahead of myself as we're still talking about kind of the all the boys. But
well, no, I mean, I want to talk about Nolte because I would agree. I think he's probably my favorite of the cast and everything else because like what you're talking about, that whole thing and the use of that voiceover. I think this is my favorite use of the Malick voiceover because of how intentionally it's meant to contrast what's going on screen. It's so vital to like the anti-war element of this movie. Or even as, you know, he's going around like this massive battleship and he's like doing a bit of like a back and forth that could be like almost an Aaron Sorkin, A Few Good Men version of this movie, where the two of them are like trading barbs. That's not nearly as important as the fact that Nick Nolte's, you know, keeping up appearances and talking with this guy who is this like younger guy who ended up getting the job he was like working his way for so long. While Nick Nolte's like talking to this guy, you hear that voiceover just being like, oh man, I fucking hate defending this like stupid fucking system, and I worked so long and I'm fucking still at this position and I gotta do it to like protect my family and all this other stuff that like it adds, like you mentioned, a lot more context for later on when he's like sending people out to die. These boys, once again, this man sending out boys to die. There's that additional layer of just like he has to keep this up because this entire military industrial complex fucking doesn't give a shit. And it's like, no, you gotta do your fucking job, I guess, which is to send these boys out to die for no real reason. I think it's really effective, and it's not just him. It's also, you know, like so many other people. Like Penn has some of those voiceovers, all this other stuff that I think really allows that kind of that breathy thing to, you know, be admittedly very funny to make fun of just like the mother, father, you always wrestle inside me. Giving it this context, I think, just makes it like so much more crucial to the movie in a lot of ways than it can be even in like A Tree of Life, where it's very beautiful and gorgeous, but also like a bit full of itself to some degree.
Malick is incredibly earnest with all of this stuff, you know, with the voiceover, which has become very like memed, or even like I think one of the moments from like Night of Cups where Christian Bale's like at the party has become like this kind of meme where you're when you like realize your like existence at like at the function, like one of those kind of memes, and it's like 100% is, and like, you know, the mother father, you always wrestle within me, like is a great meme format, I think. But I think like there's like, again with the Nolte stuff, like that's the kind of stuff where I start to think like, man, as much as we make fun of Malick, like sometimes he can be incredibly profound. People in Terrence Malick movies do not act like real people do. A lot of people will also make fun of like the frolicking in a field or the twirling on a beach or whatever, you know, and certainly there's a lot of that. But I think that like what Malick does, and it's very interior, right? Like it totally lines up with how kind of introverted and shy he can be. And so there's a lot of interiority of like just these very human emotions and these very like human grappling with like the existential like terror that people find themselves in this movie, or just kind of like with Tree of Life, like just the like cosmic, like what are any of us doing here? What is like life for me? And the way that Malick does it, although there are lines sometimes that I think some of Caviezel's like voiceover can also be a little funny, but I think it's just Caviezel's delivery. But I find a lot of it just really beautiful and like really profound, even though yes, in some of the other ones it can be a bit self-indulgent.
Well, and plus I don't see as much of like somebody not acting like a normal human in this particular movie, because I think that's like the biggest strength of this one, because there's like that whole scene where they go into the middle of that giant, it almost looks like a cornfield, and they see the two corpses that have been blown apart, just look horrific, and all the guys are just kind of looking at it, but kind of looking distant. One guy literally has his face over his eyes like a child. You just see that kind of like that really natural thing that would later come up in like a Tree of Life, where you just capture people acting very naturally in the middle of like an upsetting situation. That I think is like Malick's secret sauce in terms of him as a director, is being able to capture like those very human plight moments. That's what I love so much, but like my favorite is still Badlands, because it's a lot of capturing that element of it, while there's also, you know, a bit more of a clothesline story with like a kind of Bonnie and Clyde thing going on. There's so many shots in that movie of like Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek like just sitting and contemplating a lot, and it feels like very natural, like how someone would actually sit and think about a situation. And in the case also here with like Thin Red Line, there's a lot of that, as opposed to, you know, wandering through the fields or wandering through the music scene of Austin, Texas. Not pointing out any specific movie.
I mean, yeah, I do feel like the more kind of like unnatural elements come later in his career, but like a lot of it is like, yeah, like just people pondering and contemplating like life and, you know, whatever. And like I have this kind of like my kind of weird theory for his career is that Badlands and Days of Heaven are these movies that are very small and are very specific moments in American history. And then with his next two films, Thin Red Line and The New World, he sort of like zooms out to view like American history as a whole, like two of the most pivotal moments of American history, right? Like the quote unquote discovery, obviously it was not a discovery, of America and World War II. And I, you know, a lot of just the way that his films like do contemplate just like not just like our place, but like these systems. Like this movie is a lot more critical of like the military industrial complex and Western civilization than I like remember it being, you know. Like you have Sean Penn who gives that like great speech at the beginning where they're like in the brig, where he's just like, what do you think, there's another world out there? Like this is like the way we live. Like this is life. Like this is how we do things. Like there is no other way to like live, right? Like I think it's so fascinating the way that he kind of tackles these ideas. And like, you know, what we were talking about earlier with like the Nick Nolte stuff, like I love how later on, like when Nick Nolte is kind of like snarling and giving these orders of like, send the man now, you know, it's like you see a bit of that like conflict on his face and in his physicality. And I think that a lot of that is like, it's Malick. Like he really knows how to get these kind of small moments that like kind of reveal a lot more of like people's humanity, I think, which I think is like, yeah, it is absolutely what makes so many of his films just work so well.
Especially when he's shooting stuff that like has been in like in many war movies prior to this, of like, oh, before they go into battle, they're, you know, looking at the barracks and seeing everybody. Like when they're on that ship before they officially like do their version, it's not D-Day, but they're on like those kind of like transport boats from D-Day. Before that, when they're like on the barracks of the ship, and guys are like, you know, playing cards or smoking cigarettes, or Dash Mihawk like steals the gun with the holster and stuff like that. Those elements, I think, are like really elevated by the fact that you have, once again, a bit more of a structure to this, but also Malick able to like kind of wander around this like whole thing, but at the same time him kind of being tethered by the fact that he's shooting on film, because I think this is the last one he shoots on film. Like his New World is digital. There's a bit more of like that restraint there, which I think is a bit more allows him to not just like kind of wander willy-nilly, like say through a giant empty field at a music festival in Austin, Texas. Once again, not commenting on any specific movie with that. But
Thomas says derogatory. I say yes, please give me more.
I mean, I'll say this much: if you give me more, say Val Kilmer with a chainsaw on stage, I'm down.
My God,
that's the best part of that movie, easily.
Can't wait to watch Song to Song later. For clarification, I think the New World is still shot on film. The Tree of Life, I think, is where he starts to, because Lubeski obviously is very like big on like digital cinematography. So I think the Tree of Life is where he starts to slowly implement that stuff. But yes, but no, I agree with you. Like the fact that he's still shooting on film, and the fact that he is shooting this movie with John Toll, who is an incredible cinematographer who has shot many, many, many films. Of course, like a movie about Iron Man 3. He shot, Cloud Atlas, Braveheart, to mention Mel Gibson again, like Almost Famous. Like he's an incredible cinematographer. You see a lot of like the kind of like that wandering, like the camera kind of wanders, just like the characters do in a Malick film. But like John Toll is still like, Lubeski is kind of like very loose with it, right? He just kind of like, he loves digital cameras because they're so small and you can just go anywhere, you can do anything. They're like, so much of Night of Cups is like shot on GoPros, Yeah. And this, it's like, it's still formally very like, it's a film, and it's shot on celluloid, and it's there's that structure to it that I think like balances out a lot of like Malick's more like, I want to just like wander over here and shoot like the water or something like that. It's a nice balance, I think, for this, even though I love a lot of the later stuff too.
Well, and I still think there is that stuff, and I don't mind it nearly as much here with stuff like when he's, near the end of the movie, there's a bit where he like has a shot of the two parrots, or after that giant massive explosion on the hills happens, and you just see that little baby bird just like covered in gunk.
Oh my God, yeah.
Like trying to like move around, stuff like that. That helps to like really get you immersed in like the setting here, which I think and even then there's like a lot of like the sort of wandering elements with like all the stuff on the hills. I love like so many great sort of versions of like one of my favorite shots in a movie that's inspired so many other movies afterward. The bit in The Wizard of Oz where the Scarecrow, the Lion, and the Tin Man are looking at the Wicked Witch's castle, and they like peek over the hill. That shot is in like so many fucking movies, down to like Peter Jackson specifically has shouted out that shot for a lot of elements of like the Lord of the Rings movies. And you can tell that even here there's like so many shots, like there's the one shot where I think it's Sean Penn like kind of poking out over a hill and then like throwing a grenade over, and then you just see like from the top of the other hill just a barrage of gunshots just hitting that specific spot where there's an explosion. Stuff like that really helps you immerse in like this particular location, also the situation of being like, hey, we gotta crouch over basically like waist-high grass and not be shown, but also look over and see what's going on. That kind of tension, I think, is really elevated by his cinematography style.
Yeah, I mean the middle chunk of this movie on the hill, it so perfectly like captures what we were talking about earlier of like a war movie having to be like entertainment. And what I mean by that is not like it has to be fun, but right, it has to be like, it has to look good and be visually like pleasing. You know what I mean? Like, and also it is like incredibly horrifying. I mean, like a moment that sticks out to me so much is when Jared Leto like sends those two guys out, and they both like get shot, and you have this shot on Leto where he's like, it like lingers on him for a second, and as he comes to the realization of like I caused their deaths. And he like kind of sits with it for a moment, and it's like really chilling. But just like the way that, like what I love so much about this chunk of the movie is that like for Malick to make a movie from this perspective of like the working grunts, basically, right? Like the lower levels of like the military, just basic soldiers, and really captures like the fear that they have. Like there's the guy who like almost throws up, and they're like, okay, go get some rest. Like I'll take over, whatever. Or like the Nick Nolte character who is just like full steam ahead, like go. Or Elias Koteas' character, like just all of the ways that he captures like the varying emotions that like everyone has here, and the kind of feeling like just how long this sequence lasts. Where like then you cut to like I forget who it is, but there's one of the guys who's just like they're just waiting. They're just like sitting there, and they've been sitting there like hearing gunshots, hearing their friends die probably, and they can't do anything because like they just have to sit and like wait to see what happens. And there's so much of that, and that's I think where you get so much of like, at least for me, like just this kind of existential like, what are we doing here? Like what is the purpose of this? And even like I think Travolta earlier has the line before they ever like land where he's like, no one wants this. Like the Japanese even don't want it, and yet they're there, and so we need to find out why they're there. And it's just like this entire time all this stuff is happening, and you start to think like, why are we doing this? Which is kind of obviously what Malick is talking about in terms of war in general. Like, why are we doing this? What is the point of all this?
One could say war, yeah, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Maybe you should do a voiceover of that in here too. There should have been like Woody Harrelson just like, what is it good for? Nothing.
But yeah, but I think like I just love this middle section because you get like the shot where like they just blow the absolute shit out of like that hill.
Yeah.
Is pure spectacle. Like he's unbelievable to watch and is so loud, and like the sound design on this movie is incredible. Just I think about the way that this kind of like this movie's kind of in weird conversation with Saving Private Ryan, which came out the same year.
Both competing for Best Picture and end up losing to Shakespeare in Love, of course, as we all remember.
Right. But like the moment where they land onto like the beach, and you're expecting this kind of like Saving Private Ryan like big battle on the beach, and there's like nothing. And there's nothing for a while. Like they wander through like the field, and they see like a few of the like native people living there, but there's like nothing, and it's kind of eerie. And yet because of like Malick loves nature, as you mentioned with like that shot of the bird, like he's shooting like all this beautiful like scenery, and yet like there is this eerie quality of like, but there's danger lurking like somewhere, right? And I love the way that he handles this entire like sequence.
It does a great job of giving a pointlessness to just the fact that it's like, well, we're here for nothing. And then when something actually comes about, it even underlines further that just like, oh, we wandered around the forest, and then we got shot by like people we didn't see. Cool, great. And then down to like, one of my favorite sequences in this whole movie is Woody Harrelson's death. I think Woody Harrelson's death in this movie it's this great combination of like, it's initially darkly funny, where he just like pulls up the pin and he's like, oh no, and then there's an explosion and he loses like, I blew off my butt, like,
which is funny because Woody Harrelson's funny.
Right. And it's also just like there's like cosmic tragedy to it. Just like this guy who we saw beforehand seemed like he was all together, seemed like he would be one of like the more, like reliable soldiers, ended up accidentally blowing up his butt just because of like the weird like pensiveness that you have while you're waiting around for something to happen. And then his butt gets blown off, and then you see him gradually die and saying like such pathetic things, like one of his last lines is literally just like, I can't fuck no more, which is like funny but also deeply like pathetic and sad, and has all this like built up stuff, and all the guys are around him in a very typical war scene of just like, oh, don't worry, man, you're gonna make it, and don't lie to me. And then later just like, don't worry, we'll make sure to like call your widow and all this other stuff. And then he passes, and I think it's Dash Mihawk, who's kind of like the perfect meathead sort of dude.
Yes, him.
For this, right, where he's just like, I'm not gonna call his fucking widow. I'm terrible with like, or letter. He's like, I'm not gonna write. I'm bad at writing letters. You write it. I'm not gonna fucking do. You just say anything when a guy's like that. It's in such contrast to like, you're talking about Saving Private Ryan. That whole movie is way more about like, no, we're like a brotherhood. We're tight knit. We're a family here, even as we're like being picked off or whatever. Just like the earned this kind of thing, which I really like Saving Private Ryan, even though my hot take is I think it's lesser on the like Spielberg kind of like post-blockbuster period to me.
I agree.
Yeah, even because I mean, look, Normandy raid, no notes. One of the great sequences ever in a movie. Then there's like another 2 hours of movie after that. It's not nearly as interesting to me. Basically, until Earn This, really. Earn This is like a perfect kind of cap for that movie. But then there's a lot of like, oh yeah, Vin Diesel, Giovanni Ribisi, right? Yeah, sure, whatever. It's still all good, but it definitely feels. I think this movie has a much better grasp of kind of being like the anti-war movie that points out kind of like, oh, whatever brotherhood is here is like much more put onto us by like the military-industrial complex. It's like a propaganda thing, instead of actually being something that any of us feel about each other, because we're all desperate sad boys who want to leave and go back to our mommies.
I mean, yeah, like, you know, Spielberg, like, again, we love Steven Spielberg here. There's no shade whatsoever. But, like, you know, I think he still, like, really does, like, subscribe to that idea, right? Of, like, yes, it's a brother. I mean, he makes a show called Band of Brothers. Like, you know, it's kind of, you know. I've never seen Band of Brothers, but I would like to at some point. But, like, that idea, yeah, like, it's upended in this movie where it's like, no, these are just a bunch of people, a bunch of like young boys that you just like gave guns and armor and stuff to, and just put out there. Like there's no allegiance, there's no like, you know, camaraderie really. It is sort of like not necessarily every man for himself, but it is not that kind of tight knit that you know, as we like to kind of think. Like, I mean, a moment I think of is when there's like the soldier who's dying and he keeps like screaming in pain. And Sean Penn like runs into like through like no man's land basically, and like goes to just like ease his pain, and then like when he gets back, I think it's Elias Koteas who's like, I'm gonna commend you for the Silver Star or whatever, and Sean Penn's just like, no dude, like fuck off, like this is like basic humanity. This is not like, there's no military valor or nobility in this. This is just like, I just did that because it was a man in pain. Like it's not. You don't need to put this kind of like air of importance onto it when it's just like we're just in a shitty situation trying to help each other survive. And yeah, like so much of what this movie is about, which is like, again, which is why I say like, I don't want to say it's better to Saving Private Ryan or whatever, but it is in conversation with that movie where like Spielberg has made many films, especially The Fabelmans, about how he is like, he's incapable of making a war movie look not incredibly cinematic and entertaining. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting kind of like relationship this movie has to that, the fact that they're both out the same year and stuff like that. So
yeah, you were talking about Koteas. I want to shout out Koteas because he's one of my guys ever since I was a kid. Saw him as Casey Jones in those Ninja Turtles movies, which is funny how the kind of bookends this decade is like he was Casey Jones and now he's in a Terrence Malick movie. But yeah, his whole journey where he's much more like a faith-based man, and how he has that like reckon with faith, and like that whole scene where he's praying by candlelight, another great use of like the Malick kind of like focusing on like a specific detail element of it, and how that really crashes apart by like he was able to lead this battalion for so long, and then by the end of the movie he's unceremoniously like plucked out. Like, hey, we gotta replace you with a bigger star, George Clooney. Fuck off. You're gonna leave here. And that scene where it's like him talking to, it's like Riley and a couple of the other survivors. I feel like a family to you boys. I felt like the father. That's the one time where like the family element actually feels authentic, because you see this guy being very nurturing, being very like, you know, empathetic and caring for all these young men who he's been leading. And just the fact that, once again, the military, even when you finally get that family that they've been telling you are, they're just like, yeah, we don't really care about you and your relationship you built up with these people. Yoink! Get out of here. We gotta get Commander Clooney in, dude. I think that's such a great kind of like arc for the movie, that actually, despite how, you know, kind of like we travel from different protagonist to protagonist in terms of following them, even beyond Caviezel. It's one of the better like character arcs, I think.
I mean, like, and Koteas, he's also one of my guys. I love seeing him in anything. I mean, just the scene where he stands up to Nick Nolte, right, when they're like on the radio, is like so amazing. I mean, both of them are great in that scene. Like Nolte's doing Nolte, and he's great at that. But like, you just see like the real like conflict like Koteas is going through, and I agree. Like that moment when he's kind of saying goodbye to everyone is like, and it's not like he's saying like, you know, we're all family because we're the military, hoorah, or anything like that. It is like you've seen how much he actually cares for them and actually views them as people and not just kind of like leading them to slaughter, basically. And even his scene with Nolte, where Nolte's basically, here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna go back to wherever. You're a lawyer. Like you'll be fine. I'm gonna commend you for the Silver Star, Purple Heart, whatever. And it also is kind of this weird moment where, like, I guess Nolte thinks he's doing him a favor by being like, I can see you don't have like the spine for this or anything like that. And it's this very sad and like weird moment because like you kind of want Cotius to be there for these guys because otherwise they're, you know, I don't think Clooney gives that much of a shit about them, which like I guess we should talk about Clooney a little bit while we're
because I'm not aware of, like, he was apparently very pissed off that he got cut out of this movie.
I believe so. As I said, like many actors have been like very mad that they got cut out of a Malick movie, and I completely understand. But I don't think, how big was Clooney? I'm sure this was after he was on ER, but I don't think he had been.
No, this is the same year as Out of Sight, so he's coming off of like, especially the whole Batman and Robin debacle. So he's kind of like in the shitter in terms of his career currently at this point. He's about to become massive. But yeah, it does definitely feel like maybe if he was upset about it, it's maybe more coming from a place of vulnerability, where it's like, Malick, I'm like in a bad place. I need a win, and you're not giving me a win. This Soderbergh guy, in his movie, and it bombs. It's never gonna work out with me and him.
Yeah,
never.
I'm never gonna work with him again. And make
especially on a trilogy of massive movies.
Yeah, but I love the use of Clooney, and I think it's really funny that he's like fourth billed on this movie or something. Like he's very highly billed in the credits.
I think mainly because it's alphabetical with the casting.
Oh, sure. But he shows up at like 2 hours and 34 minutes or something like insane like that, like right before the movie's about to end. But it does kind of hammer home that idea that, like you kind of mentioned it, like it is this kind of like cyclical nature of war and violence, and like the way that like it's almost like you can imagine a movie that takes place right after this, which with George Clooney as the head of this battalion or whatever, and it's like this thing will just continue. We're gonna keep. I can't remember if it's Cotius or Penn who has the voiceover of like, you know, they keep coming, like these young soldiers that we keep just getting new ones.
I think it's Penn because the whole thing is that Cotius is like disbarred or like taken out.
Oh right, okay, he's gone by that point. Yeah, and just that idea of like, and this will keep going. Like we're just like more young people are gonna die for seemingly no reason. I think it's a great use of Clooney, you know, like I think it's funny to see him. I think it's funny how he presents himself as like, he has the whole thing where it's like, again, like Cotius, he views it as a family, but he views it in this very like rigid kind of like military industrial kind of way of like, I'm the father, and you know, I think it's Sean Penn who's like, he's the mother, and like the mother runs the family, and I, you know, everything goes through me, blah 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 blah, and it's this very like old way of thinking of things, and it says a lot while being very brief. And I think like using someone like Clooney is a really kind of smart way of doing that, even though, you know, he's not in the movie for that long, but you know, he's very charming while he's on screen, I will say.
I think this is not too long after they do the whole like they go on leave, right, where they're just kind of like chilling out, drinking beers and stuff like that, which is such a great example to me of like another scene that once again would be all over a World War II movie. It's like, yeah, the boys are catching brewskis and relaxing. They earned a bit of like, you know, what's it called? It's the
like R&R.
R&R, yeah, right. And they're just like, in this context, like they have them like kind of, you know, taking like big six packs and stuff, being like, yeah, we're having fun. But that voiceover once again is just like, there is no respite. There is no point. There's no real actual pause here. And I think this is also around the time where someone we haven't really mentioned because he's not nearly as big a star, but Ben Chaplin, who plays Private Bell, also has one of the great arcs of this movie where the whole movie he's talking about, like, man, I can't wait to go back home to my gal, Miranda Otto, in one of her early roles.
Yeah.
Yes, which is very interesting to see. Just talking about like, oh man, I can't wait to like go back. And there's a lot of those kind of like Malick shots you would get later, like very like Chastain and Tree of Life kind of shots of the two of them having, you know, like caressing each other. having a very like almost fantastical sex scene together at one point.
Right.
Which is very
I mean,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, and like just like seeing how much like this is the thing that's keeping this guy going this whole time. Is like I'm going to be able to go back home to my wife, and this is all worth it, and we'll be able to, you know, have a happy life again together, and I'll be out of this, and I feel so bad that she has to be all alone, but don't worry, honey, I'm coming. And then he gets a fucking letter. And she's like, feel so lonely. I met someone else who I can actually be around. I want you to divorce me. And Chaplin's reaction to that is devastating. He's just reading that letter, and he's not like falling over and like crying into the air, like, why? He's just like in disbelief and trying to keep composure, but he's just so clearly like in another realm. Like this war stuff is completely collapsed for him because he has nothing to go back home to. That is so fucking harsh, man. That's rough.
What I like about it, though, like, we're seeing Miranda Otto, like, these kind of shots just intercut throughout the movie, like, yeah, throughout the entire movie, like you said. And you're even, like, kind of wondering, like, whose wife is this? Like, is it Caviezel's wife? Is it, like, who, like, you know, because this movie has so many characters, and yet it does kind of, it jolts you a little bit, where you're, like, contrasting between, like, horrific scenes of, like, people dying, and then, like, clearly, like, America, and, like, American, like, the suburbs, like, there's those shots of, like, them outside or whatever.
Well, and also this is the first time we've seen a woman in, like, 2 hours, I think.
Exactly, I was gonna say, yeah. But, yeah, it's, like, really, like, devastating, and, like, really kind of, like, also doesn't make it seem like it's Miranda Otto's fault. Like, her letter is incredibly sincere, where she's just like, I'm, like, really sorry, like, I'm really lonely, like,
yeah.
I just can't deal with this, and, like, there's such a sadness to that, and I think, like, it's so great, I think, especially in the last part of the movie, where you kind of, the narrative doesn't fall apart, but it kind of, like, becomes a lot looser, where we've gone through, like, we've taken the hill, which we can kind of talk about that horrifying sequence as well, but yeah, and doesn't really have, like, a resolution necessarily for that guy. Like, it's just kind of like, and he stays in the unit, he keeps fighting, like, it's really, really upsetting,
because it's just all that he has at this point. That's now because he's, like, been subsumed by and doesn't have this, like, carrot on a stick to keep him going. He just has this now. This is what we do now. This is who we are. It's really upsetting. Yeah, and yeah, let's talk about, like, the hill battle. One of the most devastating sequences of war I've ever seen. Just because, like, it's so interesting how we have not seen really the enemy that much at all throughout so much of this. Even, like, before this, we had stuff like the bits where they're throwing grenades into, like, the little hole, like, kind of camps that they have, and just, like, throwing grenades in, like, having, like, little explosions come out. We don't see any, like, blood or viscera or body parts or anything like that. And then just seeing them, like, take that hill and really actually humanizing the enemy combatants in a way that's, like, very authentic and just terrifying, and you feel immediately immersed. Particularly that whole perspective shot thing I was talking about is so crucial to this, where you're basically in the position, almost first person, coming up to these, like, people as they're, like, terrified, begging for their lives, screaming in terror, and you're just viewing it from the perspective of, like, you're there with these Americans you've been following this whole time, and it's fucking upsetting on, like, a visceral level that I think few war movies really capture, especially with, like, any non-white person in any other war movie. It's very rare that you get this kind of earnest introspection.
Yeah, I think, like, some of the, like, a lot of, it reminds me of a lot of Vietnam War movies that do this, like Platoon, or, like, obviously Apocalypse Now. With Malick, there isn't a kind of vindictive quality where he's portraying them as, like, the enemy necessarily, where he's portraying them as, like, people. And, like, I love the particular, like, shots of, like, people, either, like, there's one guy who's just, like, praying.
Yes.
Like, he's just, like, cross-legged, just, like, praying, or just, like, people who are, like, clearly afraid. And it clearly is, like, the movie going, like, hey, like, part of this unit is, like, these scared kids. It's the same thing on the other side. Like, it's the same exact thing. These kind of, like, unsure, like, young kids who are, like, just put into battle. Like, the movie doesn't feel the need to say that in an overt way, it doesn't do a whole like, but we're all equal and we're all human kind of thing. It doesn't do it as kind of ham-fisted as that. But
Caviezel doesn't like take off glasses. Like, my God, they're just like us,
right,
scared and afraid.
He does show you just like how human this all is. And what I think he really hammers home is just the like, not the like, oh, America good, Japan bad kind of thing, but the sort of like, this is a loss for like humanity. Like, I think that's where we get a lot of the Caviezel voiceover, where he's just like, why do we do this? Like, what are we doing as like humans, as human beings? Why are we like doing this to each other? Like, how does this happen to us? And like, really, that's what he's hammering home with like a lot of these sequences, which I think is like a lot more interesting than just the like typical like, you know, yeah, USA won, like we won the war kind of thing, which it's way more horrifying and also just kind of like makes it feel more not universal in terms of like just like humanity, but like universal in terms of what war does to like human beings. An incredible sequence in this movie that I forget how horrifying it is every time I watch this movie. It's like really unsettling to watch.
Yeah, especially when it's very important that Caviezel has that moment before he has the other moment that's more personal, of like him returning back to that village and everyone's afraid of him because he's been like a part of this massive invasion that's killed so many people who are native to this island. Because if you had just had that, it would be much more of like it only matters because it affected him, as opposed to he has this empathy, and then on top of that, your entire like existence that you've been living for like the last several years is gone now. You can't go back home again, literally. It just has this like very crucial kind of context to where over the course of this journey that you've been forced to go on, you just kind of realize like, oh man, it's just it sucks for everybody. And also, I don't win out of the situation. It's not like, well, at least, even though all this is happening, I can go back to my way of life. It's like, nope, you can't, man. This just affects everybody. This is a really human, upsetting element that, like, you can't escape from after this is all over.
Yeah, I mean, like, some of the later voiceover we get where it's, like, it's sort of touching more on the whole idea of, like, war, but, like, I think it's Caviezel or Penn, again. Some the voiceover gets, you know, a lot of the guys sound kind of similar, too. Where
is that
says,
actually
like,
Billy Bob?
Turns...
Did a couple lines sneak in?
That'd be funny if you just put a couple lines in there, but it has Bad Santa. Where like, yeah, like one of them says like, war turns men into dogs and like poisons their soul. I think this is Penn who says like they want you in their like drawn to their life into their lie, and all like what a man has to do is create an island for himself. And it is this kind of like very isolationist perspective that it has of like military industrial complex in particular, but really just like what Malick is kind of wrestling with, which is just kind of like living within these systems and is there another way? Like I think the scenes with Caviezel and like when he is like with the natives and just kind of like going AWOL, like they could ring as like, you know, exoticism. But it doesn't, because of like what we're talking about, how he really just hammers home the cruelty of war and like just how like human he goes with it. And I think like just those scenes are like really, really crucial to that. Also, there's the very obvious like juxtaposition where at the beginning he's like swimming in the water, very like beautiful blue water, and then later, of course, like in the war scenes we get like fire and like all these explosions and everything. There's a really great essay, a video essay by Kogonada before he became a filmmaker, where he kind of contrasted like these elemental aspects of Malick's movies, like water and fire and, you know, light and dark and kind of all these things that I think is really is worth checking out if anyone's interested.
And also, I maybe a hot take. Malick likes doing the underwater shots, particularly after this point when he goes digital. I prefer the film ones we get here, like Caviezel and the kids swimming. I think look a lot more like majestic without just kind of looking like underwater camera footage that's like digital.
Yeah.
I think it looks a lot more like majestic and compelling on film to me.
Yeah, I mean, and not helped by like Knight of Cups, he's using like GoPros to do it.
Yep.
But I think like in Tree of Life, for instance, I think there's still a somewhat healthy balance of those two.
Mm-hmm. Even though they wrestle inside you, always they will.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking about this movie for quite a while, Brian. I want to like say a few things before we get to final thoughts.
Sure.
One of my favorite scenes is the bit right before they decide to like do the official like taking the hill battle, where Nolte is trying to get like the 7 recruits to like do a mission, and like that conversation he has with Cusack, who it's so weird seeing John Cusack give a shit.
It is.
It's so fucking weird when you go back to like these 90s or even like early 2000s, because right after this is High Fidelity, which is like arguably him at like his peak as a performer, given how much he has just gone into like, I am asleep. My eyes are open, but I am not conscious at all. They edit out my snores for these, I don't know, direct-to-VOD movies that I'm in now. Like, seeing him react off of Nolte going the whole, like, oh, you know, you're lucky. You guys are young, you got your first war right away. I've waited 15 years for my war. And that look of disappointment on Cusack's face feels so genuine. Mm-hmm. It's one of the best, I think, just silent reaction shots in this whole fucking movie. It's so amazing once again seeing Cusack at his prime, like, giving a shit and actually being a really good actor. You forget about that when you have, like, your hot tub time machines and other bullshit.
Sure, yeah. God, like, looking at his filmography is, like, it's rough, man. Like, the last times he was, like, good in something were either, like, Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson biopic.
Yes.
Or, like, Chirac, the Spike Lee movie. I think he's really good in that. But, yeah, it's very weird. I also just love how much Nick Nolte, like, because everyone in this movie has, like their name is just their name. Like, so many times Nolte will be like, good job, John. Like, I knew you could do it. And I think it's just a little funny.
I loved you didn't say anything, kid.
Yeah. Again, like, because you know this about Nolte, there's a sadness to it. And yet you get, like, Cusack going, like, oh, this is the type of person you are. Like, this is what matters to you.
Yeah.
And it's just, like, it's sad and yet, like, frustrating and yet, like, you understand why this character's like this. It's so heartbreaking. But, yeah, and you said you had a couple other moments to bring up. Anything else?
Probably my favorite bit of sort of combat in this movie is the fog scene, which feels truly like a nightmare. Where, like, I think you're focusing on Caviezel at that point, as he's just, like, darting through the fog, and you hear shots just, like, zoom past him. I think is one of the most genuinely terrifying, like, war scenarios I've ever seen. Where it's like, oh, we're not in, like, at least the wide open where I can see, like, some shots ringing out from, like, the top of a hill. There is nothing. And I'm already very scared of fog. Like, just, we're recording this not too long after we had a weird amount of fog here in Florida. And I always find fog so distressing, like more distressing than a lot of rain or anything. Because like fog just feels like so much more, like it's that weird thing where as you go, you see more, but more disappears behind you, and you're not even like as cognizant of like what's around you. I just find that so terrifying. In addition, people have guns and they're shooting you while you're in that environment. Just like really distresses me.
Oh man. I've got a fucking John Carpenter movie for you it's gonna terrify you.
Yeah, I love vampires.
Vampire fog.
The most terrifying fog of all.
Yeah, that scene's really great. It's the visibility thing as well, where it's just like you can't see anything in front of you. Especially like the very few times I've driven through like very thick fog, you like can't believe like, oh, I can't see anything in front of me, like at all. It's a really great sequence. I love the sequence later where I think it's while John Cusack and Nick Nolte, but like just them walking through that like forest that's been just like blown the fuck up, I think is like absolutely gorgeous looking, but also like is where you get a lot of like soldiers sort of like beating up like a lot of the Japanese soldiers, which is incredibly disturbing.
One other thing I wanted to point out, the kind of like weird bookending element of I think it's a crocodile, right? That like shows up at the very beginning. You see it like go into the water because like I know we're in Florida and I'm aware of alligators. Well, we're aware of alligators, but we're not as aware of like a croc because I know the whole thing is the nose, right? The nose is usually different as like a distinguishing factor. But I don't know. I just kept doing croc because I just kept doing the fucking, the crocodile hunter voice. Crikey.
He should do voiceover for a Malick movie.
Well, I
should have
mean,
done it.
he can't because he's passed.
I know,
right?
he-
And we're all like very much still mourning Steve Irwin. How dare you? This crocodile in nature, just quite like getting into like the water, and like sinking down. And then later on, we see another one that's been captured by them, basically.
Oh,
and you just see this poor fucking animal, even though it could easily tear us apart if we let it. Necessarily, but just you have a pure innocence for like this killing machine who's just been like tied up, and all these fucking drunken soldiers are like looking at it and ogling it, and it's just like is this tied up, and he's like kind of moving around like, man, I don't want to fucking be here. It's a really great kind of like bookending thing for the movie to show like nature and all its tranquility, and then it being subsumed by these guys who've captured it.
I do think that like the sort of bookending with the crocodile is a lot of what Malick does of like contrasting like nature versus people and humanity, and a lot of what this movie is like you mentioned like the scene where with the little like bird, but a lot of this is about like the beauty of nature, like especially just the way he shoots this island, like a lot of those like steady cam shots going up the hill where you see just like the grass like flowing in the wind. There's like the one shot where like you see the sun just like it kind of go across the field, and it's just like holy shit, this is like stunning. And so much of like the like beauty of nature, and especially like later when we get like the I don't know if you like forest kind of swampy area where we get like our last set piece with Caviezel, and just how like beautiful it looks, and yeah, how like humanity and like their sort of like lust for war is destroying all of this. It's really like devastating. Caviezel's death is really impactful, I think, just the way that he kind of sacrifices himself and lets Brody, where we get him come back. It's just a really like devastating set piece, but also especially with the final shot of this movie with like the helmet, I think is like so gorgeous. I think it's like just really, 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 really beautiful. And yeah, just the final set piece is like, it kind of comes out of nowhere. Like you're not expecting there to be this kind of final like thing going on. I can't really remember what exactly it is, right? Because they're like going through the swamp, but they're surrounded by enemies, and it's like I think by this point it's John Cusack who's leading the unit. I can't remember entirely.
Right, this is when it's like the seven guys basically are kind of like tasked to go up the hill, I think. Yeah. Apologies for like the weird, like if we don't remember the exact sequence of events, because this movie shockingly has a very like interesting, weird, ethereal pacing to it in terms of like events happening.
It's the thing I love about Malick, though, I think, as a whole, is that his movies, like, feel very dreamlike and very, like you said, ethereal. It's why I think, like, for me at least, like, Malick movies really sit with me and really, like, I think about them for days and weeks later because, like a dream, like, you remember these very specific images, and then there's kind of these, like, sections in between where you're kind of, like, just going through it, and it's kind of hazy, and it's very, like, it's not all the way there, but it's what I really love about a lot of his movies is that like when you go back to them, you kind of remember a lot of this stuff. Like I've mentioned like many times throughout, like, oh, I don't remember this part or this part. Like it's what I love about going back to his movies, and it's also what I love about thinking about his movies is that like you can just think about these beautiful images or these like specific moments that like are very memorable. And just the kind of like profound nature of like what he's really doing and kind of talking about and wrestling with in this movie is really like it always sits with me. A lot of what his movies do kind of have that quality.
It's very interesting with that this particular kind of set piece. Caviezel died for our sins, and he's
God.
That man, it's just so. Because we talked about this with Deja Vu, but it's so fucking weird that like that guy's a genuinely really good actor, and it's a real shame that he's a fucking weird QAnon piece of shit.
Yeah.
Because like he's a genuinely really good actor when he wants to be, and he's like very good in this. Particularly, it's kind of like a weird recurring spine from like beginning to end of the movie to like hang it on, and he works really well for that. I think particularly his death really resonates, even though once again it's the Jesus complex, like he has to die for our sins all the time, Brian.
It really is, yeah. I mean, and he is good as this kind of like not entirely a Malick stand-in of kind of he's a bit more spiritual and religious, and I think when it's Woody Harrelson dying or when it's someone dying, he kind of says like you'll be okay because you were like you protected your men. I think it's Woody Harrelson. He says like you protected your men, like you were good, like you're gonna go to heaven basically. Yeah, we gotta stop talking about Jim Caviezel.
That's true. We're going to put a moratorium, I think, even though we were going to do Passion of the Christ for next season, I think. I think we'll table that for another time. But yeah, let's do final thoughts. We've been talking a while. Brian, any final thoughts on Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line?
Yeah, I mean, another shot I just thought of, like, again, in this kind of Malick way that you, like, kind of just, these thoughts kind of just, at least for me, like, just will come to me and just kind of like, oh my god, what a shot. I think of, it's when they're going up the hill and we get this the POV inside the bunker.
Yes.
And we just see like the gun, and it really holds on that for a second. And you don't know, like, is there someone here? Is it abandoned? And then you see the gun slowly turn, and you see like a hand. And it's an incredible, like, just small piece of like cinema there, but like just the way he's able to pace that scene and just kind of reveal this information and have that menace just kind of creep in. I think it's like it's really great, and he doesn't have a lot of moments like that, Terrence Malick, because his movies don't really go for that kind of like I don't know, that kind of pacing that he usually does. But that was just a moment I thought of. But as far as The Thin Red Line goes, it's kind of funny because like I think this movie is an absolute masterpiece, and yet it's not even in my top 3 or 4 Terrence Malick movies. You know, I think he's someone who really just like speaks to me in particular, and I know that like it is very his movies are very easy to kind of make fun of, and he has a lot of things that are kind of silly and can seem kind of goofy, but I think really like he's an incredibly spiritual filmmaker. His movies really contain this very spiritual and cosmic, you know, profundity, and yet he's incredibly human, you know, and he really, with this movie in particular, like focuses on people and what they're going through and the conflicts that they live through and they have to kind of go through, with like the Nick Nolte character, for instance, but also just this idea of wrestling with like your place in a society, and you know, do you want to be a part of a system that is doing so much harm to the world, which is what his next film, The New World, is about, I think, as well. But also it's what a lot of his movies are about living in like these systems, and if there's another way to sort of exist outside of these, you know, kind of evil institutions. And I think the way he does this with this kind of like wandering, roving camera that's almost always moving, especially later in his movies, like he's almost always moving the camera somewhere, or there's always movement within the frame itself. And I feel like there's just certain filmmakers that just like really like speak to you, and it's kind of almost, it's really hard to kind of parse like what is it about Malick that I really love. But it is the voiceover, it is the like the way his characters kind of like are always contemplating, you know, there's so much contemplation in his movies, there's so much just like wondering about our place in, obviously, like I said, those institutions, but eventually like America, and then like the world. And just I just love the way that he kind of has always had this very singular style, and you see it kind of slowly unfurl as he kind of like gets to his later movies. And like even in like those later movies, I think, which are quite flawed, like To the Wonder, even I as a Malick head, like it's not the best movie. I don't love To the Wonder, and yet like there's that shot with Ben Affleck and Olga Kurylenko in the convertible as they're like driving to that like big castle thing.
Or of course Ben Affleck ordering at a Sonic.
Or the stuff at the Sonic, which is incredible as well, you know, or the stuff at the grocery store, where it's like, it's incredibly weird to see Malick go contemporary, I think, but that's a discussion for another time. But I just find so much like beauty in his movies, and so much of what his movies are about it's what I love, and he's like really one of the biggest filmmakers for me that really kind of like unlocked what movies can be, where like, again, his movies have a narrative. Even like Knight of Cups has a loose narrative, but they have something you can cling on to, and yet from a filmmaking standpoint, from an editing standpoint, from a script standpoint, he's doing things that are incredibly weird and unconventional and, you know, experimental, and some of it's kind of silly, some of the most beautiful imagery you'll ever see, and some of it's kind of, you know, somewhere in the middle, and some of it doesn't work. But I really just love everything he's done. I love almost all of his movies, basically, and this is no exception, I think. And, you know, it's a real power to how great of a filmmaker he is in my mind, that, like, I love this movie so much, and it's not even, like, one of my favorite ones that I think of all the time. But in terms of, like, this particular movie, to kind of wrap up, like, the cast is incredible. There's, like, so many... We talked about just how many great performances are in this movie, but, like, my MVP, I think, is Nick Nolte in this one. Like, really watching it this time, I really kind of tuned into what his character's story is and his character's arc is, and I found it deeply moving and really, 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 like, powerful. But just the, like, incredible war sequences, you know? Like, we talked earlier about how, like, it gets into this kind of ethical question of, like, what's okay to put in a movie? It's still war. How much do you want to depict that in a kind of entertaining kind of way? But it just, again, incredible visuals. John Toll, great score by Hans Zimmer. We haven't really talked about, but
yeah,
it's a really wonderful score. I love the music in this movie. Yeah, a fascinating movie that I think re-kickstarted Malick's career, and he would go on to, like, just keep making, like, incredible movies. Yeah, I love The Thin Red Line. It's a masterpiece. I adore it.
And as someone who isn't quite as in the bag for Malick as you are, who at least has, like, a variety of takes on the very different movies, I would say this is personally my second favorite of the ones I've seen, right under Badlands. I think just because it has a lot of the Malick-isms, I think, applied to a much more interesting clothesline of a story that still has a lot of the emotional palpability. And also, I think this has some of his best just, like, bits of human interaction I've seen that feel the most kind of, like, authentic. Like, there's a scene we haven't talked about where, like, one of the soldiers has, like, been shot and is dying, and Sean Penn goes over to him. And then Sean Penn has to leave to, like, help some other guys out. And you just have a brief moment where the guy says goodbye to Sean Penn, and Penn is, like, contemplating, realizing, like, I'm the last face this guy's gonna fucking see. I have to actually give him, like, a genuine goodbye from not just this interaction, but life in general. That feels very authentic. Or I think there's a later bit that Caviezel says while they're in the middle of that R&R sort of sequence, where somebody asks him about, like, you ever feel lonely? Only around other people? That's a very poignant kind of, like, back and forth conversation. I don't know, obviously, how much of this is from the novel. I haven't read the novel. But it does feel like at least he knows, like, which pieces to, like, implement here in ways that feel, once again, like, very human, and not just in a way that, as I think he goes on to his modern period, it becomes much more human from just, like, a perspective shot of just looking literally at, like, something that feels like you're from the perspective of, like, a little kid in Tree of Life, or from, you know, like, one of various Hollywood celebrities in Knight of Cups, or from some scraggly asshole in Austin in Song to Song. This feels much more kind of like this interesting human element. Once again, has a bit more of, like, a grounding to it, like the way it's shot in film, and the way that we're just interacting with a lot of guys who feel very natural in terms of how scared they are, how much fear they're pent up, and how much they're just, like, trying to put it deep inside them so they can do the most horrific act possible, which is to kill another person. I'll say this much. I don't know if I quite agree with, there's a voiceover bit about what killing someone is worse than. I think that's arguable necessarily. I'm not going to say what necessarily, the comparison. Both seem pretty bad. Hot take. I don't like either of those things. But I think they really sell at least the fact that, like, seeing someone die in front of you, or, like, sending somebody off to their death, any of these other things, there's, like, such a anti-humanist perspective on it that is so horrific and is so genuine. It feels like one of the best examples, truly, to me, of a war movie that makes me so never want to pick up a gun and put on fatigues at all. Yeah. I was already very much not in that camp, and this is just further emphasizing that over 3 hours, why I would never want to do that.
I mean, that line that he delivers is, like, I think it's right after he, like, they're on the hill, and they just see like a bunch of soldiers like way out in the distance, like they can't even see their faces, and they just like shoot them, and there's this like very impersonal like, you know, there's a distance to it that also is like really hammers home like how like devastating that line is.
Yeah. But, you know, on that note, let's go into our usual segment, Between the Lines. So on Between the Lines, every episode, Brian and myself discuss a film. We recommend a film that is either in conversation with the one we're talking about today, or could be an alternate choice for, in this case, the M for Masterpiece for Criterion. And I'm going to start here, and I'm going with one that, when we were planning this out, the season in general, my biggest regret, honestly, was not covering a Wes Anderson movie. Because, that feels hand in hand with Criterion. Like, you gotta talk about a Wes Anderson movie. He's so integral to that brand at this point. Even the first Criterion disc I ever got was the Royal Tenenbaums DVD, which was packaged like a little bookcase and stuff like that. And I was just, so mesmerized by, the power of, oh, wow, this packaging is not like your Snapcase DVD that I'm fucking used to. So I'm gonna recommend a Wes Anderson movie, but specifically The Grand Budapest Hotel. Which is a film from 2014, has this interesting kind of turducken of a storytelling element, like many recent Andersons in particular, of we are witnessing basically a young girl reading a book that is about a guy detailing a story in which a younger version of himself interviewed this guy who was detailing his younger life. And specifically, that person we're mainly following is Zero, as played as an older man by F. Murray Abraham and later by Tony Revolori in the actual bulk of the movie that we see, who's a bellboy that works for the titular hotel, which is it's a fictionalized country, but it's Bavarian mountains, kind of like giant, purple mountain, kind of like covered in snow, little cozy hotel that is managed by Ray Fiennes. And, Ray Fiennes kind of keeps Tony Revolori under his wing, kind of has him help out with all the various different things that he does, which isn't just the usual you gotta clean up stuff, but also Ray Fiennes' constant romances with older women who he basically treats as sugar mamas to a certain degree, and just a constant womanizer of these old ladies, but also how he avoids certain authority figures that come around, mainly personified by Edward Norton as the leader of this kind of army battalion that's around. It eventually results in one of the many women he's wooed, Tilda Swinton, dies, and then he ends up getting bequeathed this famous painting that has a lot of people trying to storm after it, including speaking to this particular movie, Adrian Brody showing up and his hitman guy Willem Dafoe. But also, a lot of the people pop up: Jeff Goldblum, Matthew Almoralik, Harvey Keitel,
Saoirse Ronan,
of course, they play the love interest for Tony Revolori's character. And this is my favorite Anderson. I'm very pro Anderson. There's only a couple of movies I'm not a huge fan of, but I think this is his masterpiece. Probably not helped by I saw the premiere at South by Southwest, where Wes Anderson did a Q&A afterward with Jason Schwartzman, who's also in this movie but barely. And I was in the second row, so I saw their corduroy right in front of my face. But I think as this movie has aged, I've continued to go back to it the most, I think, of the Andersons. For a while, it was Tenenbaums was my favorite, because that was the first one. But I think Budapest is a masterwork of just, his, specific production design with, the little kind of dollhouse effect of, this hotel, the amazing, immaculate look of, the lobby and the different rooms. But then also that storytelling element, I think, is, something that Anderson always chases after. And I think this is the best exploration of it, where it's just, what matters is that a story can keep going, and that it has these very human things that affect other people, and how people come in and out of whatever the story is. And there's funny moments, there's beautifully tragic moments, and an amazing ensemble. Everyone's great in this movie, but Ray Fiennes is maybe at his peak, and he's a guy who's done some incredible performances, but I think this is absolutely his top-notch, especially like comedically, but also when things do get emotionally like heart-wrenching, he really like pulls that out as well. His whole back and forth with Revelori, who is a revelation in this movie. Waka waka. I think like their relationship is sort of like a surrogate father-son thing. Is beautiful, and I think really like is the emotional backbone of this whole movie. That also has like some of my favorite shots from Anderson. Like I constantly think of like the one shot of Revelori looking at Saoirse Ronan as like the lights are circling around her face is like I think one of the best shots in a movie of the 21st century, quite frankly. But yeah, I think it's a masterwork for Anderson. Just one of my favorite movies in general. And where does this one rank for you amongst the Andersons? I'm curious.
It's not one I've revisited, although I am holding, as we speak, my Criterion that I have not watched yet.
Great set.
Because it's a gorgeous box. It's like all of his like the packaging and the artwork they do for his box sets is amazing. Or for his like just Blu-rays are amazing. I think this is my favorite of his films. Maybe I would put Asteroid City up there. That one has really stuck with me over the past year. But I think this movie is it is. I think his best film. I think like just the set design and like just like you talking about that dollhouse effect with the actual kind of miniatures he builds. Like, you know, I'm a fucking slut for miniatures. I love miniatures so much. Some of my favorite things in all of movies.
You put that on your dating profiles, right? Slut for miniatures.
Oh, I really should. But they're incredible. Like, just the actual hotel itself. Like, I remember watching, like... Because I saw this in theaters when it came out, and, like... I just remember watching videos of people building these sets and just talking about these miniatures that they built, and just they're so intricate and so beautiful and so amazing, and I love the way he uses them. I love the way he uses like perspective and everything that like just that the way he uses storytelling and like the whole stories within the stories. But what I also just love about Wes Anderson, and like a lot of this gets lost I think when we talk about Anderson, because he has this very colorful palette and his characters are very eccentric. I mean, this movie has like one of the funniest moments in a movie, I think, when Norton comes to arrest Ray Fiennes at the hotel, and he just like, "You think I did it?" And then he just like runs away. It's so funny, so good. Yeah. But there's also like in all of Wes Anderson's movies, like you get a sense like a real sadness to his movies. And a real, like, kind of melancholy you don't expect, especially considering a lot of his color palette. But I think, and it's always been here, of course, like Rushmore has it, Tenenbaums has it. Like, the sadness has become very, like, deep-rooted in a lot of these movies. And I've loved that as well. The cast is great. It's, like, it's so funny. And you have, like, I mean, even some more people that, you know, even you didn't mention, like, you have Jude Law, you have Tom Wilkinson, Lea Seydoux, like crazy Bob Balaban. Like, it's a huge cast. It's a great cast, and it I think will ultimately go down as maybe his best film. Although, for me, I'm really waiting to watch this. I'm probably going to pretty soon after this conversation. But like, yeah, I think this will go down as one of his best films.
Well, Brian, what's your recommendation for Between the...
Okay, so I was wrestling with this a little bit, much like a Terrence Malick movie. There were two picks that were wrestling inside me. Because I recently, I'll mention it here, it's not my proper recommendation, I'll cheat a little bit. I recently got the Parasite Blu-ray on Criterion. Great film, a masterpiece, incredible. Maybe the last moment of happiness we have ever known is Bong Joon-ho winning, Parasite winning Best Picture, but... I'm going to be a little bit selfish with my pick here. I'm going to recommend another Terrence Malick movie that we've seen, because all of his movies up until The Tree of Life have been put in the Criterion collection. They have great releases. I love like The New World. Criterion is incredible. The Tree of Life one is amazing. Has an extended director's cut that is like just over 3 hours, I think. It's really incredible. I'm going to recommend Knight of Cups in particular, because it does not have a Criterion release. And... I don't see that changing anytime soon, because, again, I don't think these movies, although they have a kind of slight cult following among my fellow Malick heads, they're out there. I don't think they have kind of reached this kind of cultural reappraisal that it would need for a Criterion release. And still, I think this is one of my favorite Malick films, like maybe top 3. So, Knight of Cups, in case anyone doesn't know out there, we mentioned it a little bit, but I'll just kind of give a brief synopsis here. Christian Bale is playing this screenwriter in Hollywood named Rick, who is having this existential crisis of wanting to work in Hollywood and maybe not wanting to work in Hollywood, maybe wanting to leave. And as he has various encounters with multiple women throughout the film, like Imogen Poots, his ex-wife, Kate Blanchett, Teresa Palmer, Frida Pinto, Isabel Lucas, Natalie Portman, who is a married woman that he becomes involved with. I mentioned earlier how this has that kind of that kind of shambly, Frankenstein, improvisational nature that a lot of Malick movies have, the later Malick movies have. But I find this movie really powerful, and some of it's for a lot of very personal reasons that I won't get into here. But there's so many images in this movie I find completely incredible. We mentioned like the party scene earlier, with like a bunch of different people that show up in this movie. Michael Wincott shows up, Kevin Corrigan shows up, like so many weird people. Jason Clarke. I love that sequence as just this incredible set piece of like a Hollywood life. And I love movies set in like, I love movies that kind of depict Hollywood as this kind of like beautiful and gorgeous place, but kind of dark and really like sad and maybe evil. And this movie does an incredible job of that, I think. It's a lot of, there is this kind of this tarot card kind of gimmick that Malick uses, where he has title cards for each of the different tarot cards, like the Hanged Man or whatever. I'm not into tarot cards. I don't know what any of them means, but certain stuff like this kind of fable-like story that the narrator, who's Ben Kingsley, by the way, Sir Ben Kingsley, gives of this prince who goes from the east to the west, and when he gets there, the people pour him a cup, and he forgets that he was a prince, and he forgets the one thing that he's been looking for, the pearl. And I find that a really fascinating allegorical way of representing Malick's time in Hollywood. But also, like, I think Christian Bale's really good in this. I think Kate Blanchett is the best performance in this entire movie. I think she, not in it that much, but I think what she kind of gives and just how she carries herself, I think she really kind of fits into the Malick kind of world and the Malick kind of sensibility. I'm a little upset they've never worked together some more, because I think that would be really, really great. But even like people like Antonio Banderas show up in this movie, and he gives a really great little kind of speech that is also kind of a lot of what the movie is about, this kind of weird yearning for finding connection with other people, in particular women, which I think is quite interesting, and how the movie, much like its character, and it's clearly a lot of what this kind of movie is about, of these women who just kind of like float in and out of his life and in and out of the movie itself, I think is quite interesting, and is certainly Malick kind of wrestling with this idea of, you know, what men want. But yeah, I think also just him wrestling with like his family. Like Brian Dennehy's in this movie, rest in peace. He plays his father. Wes Bentley plays his brother. And there's just a lot of this sort of ruminating on just existentialist ideas, and Malick really kind of going through this, like, or representing him going through this kind of crisis of like just what he wants. And like, I mean, there's some really, you know, the voiceover in this is like all Malick's movies, is very, you know, like you mentioned, just kind of like it gets a little bit silly at times, but I think there's some really incredible like interior kind of monologue. You know, like there's a scene where like Cherry Jones, who plays Bale's mother, like says like, you know, sometimes you told me that you felt like a spy, like you had to pretend wherever like everywhere you went, which like fuck, like I find that incredibly like sad and deep and really like meaningful. I also remember when I watched this movie in a theater, which had many walkouts, and then when it ended, people absolutely hated it. They thought it was terrible, and everyone just left very angrily because I think they were expecting like a great love triangle between Christian Bale, Kate Blanchett, Natalie Portman, but it is instead this very weird odyssey where Christian Bale just wanders through LA, which I find incredibly moving, and also has a really great score by Hanan Townsend, which I think is like a lot more of a banger than I remember. Like the score is really great, and like we mentioned, incredible cinematography by Emmanuel Lubezki, who just, again, it's very loose, and you really see him loosen up and just kind of like it's quite playful the way that him and Malick kind of like will shoot just like random things, or will shoot a random like tree, but from a particular angle that really just kind of adds a real depth to it. It's not one that I think is beloved or that a lot of people love. I know it has a little bit of a following. I just really love it. I revisit it all the time. It moves me. I don't know, but yeah, I know we talked about a little bit about this throughout the episode, but yeah, I don't know. You're not as into this one though.
I mean, I'll say this much. I think it's the best of the post Tree of Life Malicks I've seen. And
Sure.
I don't dislike this movie. I find a lot of it interesting. I think just the fact that he's able to shoot so much of this, like I mentioned, the sound stages, but even just like the streets of LA with like nobody around, making LA one of the busiest hubs in America feel like a ghost town, I think is like incredibly impressive. My biggest problem, I think, with like some of that late period Malick is it does feel a bit like white people problems. I think Song to Song is much more guilty of that even than like Night of Cups, because it's much more centrally about how vapid that existence is. And I think the movie also gets to like certain universal truths that I find much more compelling. Like the Brian Dennehy stuff's probably my favorite element of the movie, where you're just seeing him kind of realize like it seems like he's almost close to like dementia basically, and like he's falling apart, and there's like a bit more conflict with like when we do see Bale and like Wes Bentley argue as brothers. I find that stuff really compelling, and that takes a lot for me to find Wes Bentley compelling. That's very rare, and it's really interesting that Malick can capture that with like a looser narrative. But yeah, I think Dennehy's performance in particular, I think, devastates me. Like there's that shot of him like in that kind of like office area, like in the building, and he's like the only person there sitting at a desk. And just this like great visual metaphor for this guy just being completely past his prime and having nothing left, and how he takes it out on his son, who has this much more successful life, but also an empty one at the same time. I find a lot of that stuff compelling. I can agree with people that it feels a bit more aimless.
Sure.
And
I mean, absolutely.
And that whole like improvised style isn't my favorite version of Malick. But I think it works better for this particular story that he's going for, as opposed to, not mentioning any names, but I'll say this: it's a better use of Natalie Portman, for example, than another movie that would later. I can't emphasize how much I fucking hate Song to Song.
Wow.
But I've been very subtle about it this whole episode. But Night of Cups, I don't dislike nearly as much. I think that one is a bit more interesting than people give it credit for. But yeah, with enough flaws to where it's not my fave. Malick.
Yeah, it is the one I think that like, if any of these late era Malicks were to be kind of like reappraised or whatever, I think this would be the one. I also do want to, because you mentioned Brian Dennehy's like part in this movie. He has just like one of the most just incredible voiceover lines where he says like, "My son, the light has gone out in your eyes," which is just like, fuck. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But I think like out of all of these movies, I would kind of want this to get a Criterion release, just because it's one I think about. And again, like to like make my final point, like I mentioned like how Malick's movies feel like these dreams, and like I'll just remember certain images or certain like bits from movies or whatever, and this is one of those ones where I just like, again, there's stuff in this movie where I just kind of think like, what are we doing here? You know, like a lot of the stuff of like wandering LA like throughout the homeless population, I think is kind of like, okay, Malick, I think you're
Yeah.
going a little bit,
Yeah.
but
Rich
again,
white
like,
people
there's-
problems once again.
It is I mean, of course, but then like yeah, everything you mentioned about like just portraying LA as this like lonely, isolated place with like this ghost town, like not very many movies give me this exact same feeling, and there's so many times that I just kind of like think of individual images from this movie and just kind of like go like, my God, he just, no one does it like him, man. And I think just like this weird, interesting experimental period is so fascinating for him. But yeah, give it a Criterion release. Criterion, come on, throw me a bone. Come on.
Give him a 4K. Come on, give him a 4K. Come on. Yeah, well, on that note, let's repeat our titles for everybody out there in case you want to add these to your watch list. I recommended the 2014 Wes Anderson film, The Grand Budapest Hotel.
And I recommended the 2016, depending on your release date, film from Terrence Malick, Knight of Cups.
And on that note, we're going to start wrapping up here, but we got to thank some people. We got to thank Burial Grid for all the music that's used in our show. Listen to his music at burialgrid.com. We want to thank Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 over on Twitter. And thanks to our Patreon supporters at patreon.com/cinema, number 2 letter for just $1 a month, or for $3 for an individual piece of audio if you prefer to just sample. You can listen to some bonus content we do over there, which includes, we'll be around this time in January, we'll be putting out a review roundup for some of the other Oscar releases that we hadn't talked about in our December one or our November one, which all those are available over there on the Patreon as well. And our big bonus episode is going to be an audio commentary. We're literally going to plan out which commentary that is right after we're done here. So we'll announce it at the end of our next episode, which movie we'll do a commentary on. But, that stuff's there. Marco Polo is also there, the Adult Swim podcast to do with Tori DePina, and some other, bits and bobs you'll be able to listen to. And also you'll be able to vote for at least, like one movie we do for every season. We'll be announcing what that particular movie that you'll be voting for next season is at the end of our next episode, all that stuff. But if you just contribute that $1 a month, it not only gives you access to all that stuff, but it helps us out, allows us to do more stuff on the main feed and experiment with stuff on the Patreon. Really helps out, really appreciate it. And, you can find us on whatever hell site you peruse. If we're there, we're at Cinema number 2 letter. That's our screen name. And you can find me mostly on Blue Sky and Letterboxd at Not the Who's Tommy. And I also do some writing occasionally at film-cred.com.
Yeah, you can also find me still on Twitter, but also on Blue Sky, at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or, for more consistency, you can follow me on Letterboxd as well, just at my name. Yeah, follow me on there to see all my Terrence Malick rewatches and ruminations.
Yes, as he wrestles with them inside his writing. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, you want to listen to all the other great shows that are on the network. And you can also dig into the archives in our Podbean main feed for all the past seasons of Cinema to the Letter, and also all the old Double-Edged Double Bill stuff I did with Adam Thomas. All of that is there for you to listen to at the Podbean main feed. And if nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight for some people in these trying times, but the absolutely free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility. Just allow people to discover us, like Terrence Malick discovering a little bird on a little tree limb, so he can shoot it for about as long as our episodes go. I'm sure. But now, Brian, we'll at least wrap up by teasing our next episode, our final Criterion season episode, our 8th atypical choice. We will be covering one that does have a spine number, but is our out-of-print choice. You can't get this DVD the usual first-rate market. You have to go either to eBay or whatever various avenues you go down to watch Life of Brian and get that DVD of the Criterion edition. But I'm very curious to talk about this because Monty Python was a big thing for me when I was younger, and I love a lot of their movies. I think this is in particular their masterpiece, but you've only seen Holy Grail so far.
Correct, yeah. And I also, unlike you, I did not really grow up with Monty Python. Came to it a lot later, like in high school when I watched Holy Grail and stuff. I've never seen Life of Brian. Kind of ironic, because it's my name.
Oh, right.
Although...
Yeah.
Although it's spelt wrong, so that's okay.
Right.
Yeah, I'm very curious though because I love Holy Grail. I have a rocky relationship with Terry Gilliam, which we can maybe get into a bit as it's a bit related. But I've never seen Life of Brian, and I've heard very, very good things. And I've heard people also say that it's, I think like you have said that it's better than Holy Grail. So I'm very excited, and I like what I've seen from kind of the Monty Python sketches and stuff. I love the like art style. I love that kind of just the comedic sensibility. I like that stuff. So I'm very curious, and it's kind of fun to end on a movie like a Monty Python movie for the season. I think it'll be quite fun.
Yes, but that's for next time. Until then, everybody, just make sure you walk that thin red line very carefully.
That thin red line.
That thin red
I'm
line.
walking it. You gotta walk.
and for, of course, John C. Reilly, you gotta walk it.
Oh, yeah, you gotta walk hard.